Well, welcome everybody to our online workshop on group norms for effective communications for the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky Affiliate Community Foundations. We are glad that you have joined us, and today we're going to talk about ways that you can consider how your board members can communicate a little more clearly with one another. As usual, we'll kind of go over some webinar pointers to start out. So please feel free to turn on your video if you like. Please be aware that we are recording, and that because we're recording and we're doing this as a call, your video may show up on the webinar recording. If you don't want your video to show up, then you just click the little video camera so that it has a red line through it and it will not show up. Also, please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. This will help alleviate background noise and feedback. And if you have questions throughout the webinar, just feel free to speak up in real time. Unmute yourself to do that, or just put your questions into the chat room, either way. So, and we will be doing or providing a link to this recording that'll be shared later along with any follow-up materials. So let's get started by taking a look at the objectives for this webinar. So what we're going to do today is kind of discuss some of the value of why it's important to create group norms when you have a group or a board that's working together. We're going to explore some very specific kinds of norms, or really we're defining these as behaviors for effective communication. And then we're going to talk about how to apply these. So we'll have a conversation about how to apply the behaviors and the group norms that we've gone over. If you'll think about a time that you joined a group or a board where you were new to that group, but the other people were not new to that group. So try to recall that first meeting or event that you had as a group member. So take a couple of minutes to think about that. And then we're going to come back and talk about what are some of the challenges that you experienced as a new member, and what did the group do well for new members. And so if you've had a chance to think about that and have a kind of an example of a time that you joined a group or a board that was new to you but not others, somebody share about your experience with that.
I don't mind going first if that's okay. This happens to me a lot. And so I've actually kind of developed my own personal protocol on how to be able to handle these things. The biggest part for me is the overwhelming number of new people that you're meeting, and trying to figure out why they're at the meeting. And so it usually helps if they do a roll call at the beginning. And I'll actually take notes. If we're around a square table, I will try to put names, at least first names, but names in front of the different positions, attempting to be able to get some type of map in my head of these folks that I'm meeting. Always appreciated if the moderator will acknowledge this being my first visit. And even excited if they allow me a moment to just tell why I decided that I wanted to be a part, because that sometimes it shares with the group my expectations of what I think they're doing and hope that that's what they are doing. I know when I've integrated others into new situations, I've always tried very hard to make sure they get personal introductions to every member. And then always make myself available for questions that they might have at the end. And I will, and for my own personal protocol, I will keep notes of questions of things that I don't understand. And the biggest thing that I really, every single one of these places have their own abbreviations, acronyms, initialisms, all of those things. And I always appreciate the moderator or facilitator who goes out of their way when they have new members to say, oh, by the way, RFP means this, or POC means this, because it acknowledges that, you're talking in slang, and not everybody knows that slang. So those are some of the things that that I've experienced and little helps that I've tried to implement to integrate myself in as quickly as I can.
Great, and those are all good pointers. The acronym thing is something that I think is huge, especially in the kind of work that we're doing with community foundation boards and nonprofit organizations, that we have our own language that we speak, and not everybody understands that language. So that's great.
Yeah,
Anybody else?
exactly. That's what I was going to say. And as I've gotten older, you know, I do, sometimes I'll just ask them to kind of, you know, provide some background information on it, because, you know, I'm new to the board, and sometimes, most of the time, they're pretty good about that. But when I was younger and getting on board, you know, of course, I would have never spoken up and said, you know, I don't quite understand that. You know, could you explain that in a little bit more detail? But as I've gotten older, I've figured out that, you know, sometimes they forget, the new people don't have the background in this, you know, maybe a board, maybe I really shouldn't be on, but I just couldn't find myself, and I didn't say no, you know, is one of those cases, which I have done a lot. So I just, sometimes I'll just speak up and ask them to try to share a little bit of background on that I'm not as familiar with, and usually they're pretty good about that. So, but the acronym thing, it's, you know, you go over here in healthcare, their acronyms are totally different. I mean, sometimes it might be the same acronym, but they don't have the same meaning. And that's what was really helpful. In a couple of groups that I had ended up, you know, being the chair of, we actually did a list of acronyms that then when they joined the board, then they would know, we gave them that list of acronyms. And of course, you know, trying to be familiar with all the people. And then of course you have turnover on the board, you know, besides the time that, you know, you're supposed to roll off, you know, but you have turnover, and then you have to add new board members. And so it does make it difficult. But the acronym is it's so different in each world, you know, economic development, healthcare, nonprofit. I mean, they're all, it's all different.
So those are some of the things that impact how a new group member might feel when they join. And the other thing that those new group members may not always be aware of are the norms that the group has created in the way that they work together. And these are things that sometimes happen over a period of time that are unspoken. That's about the way the group interacts with each other. Everything from, you know, where a person sits, you know, oh, that's such and such's chair, you don't sit there. But a new person may not know that. And so it's not a real welcome feeling sometimes to come in and sit down, and somebody says, oh, wait, that's Diane's chair, you're not supposed to sit there. So just those types of things. And so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So both spoken and unspoken norms define a group. And if we take a look, first of all, at what might actually be some unspoken norms, let me know if you've ever had this experience in a group. Our meetings will start late and will always run past the end time that we've designated. We'll always cut each other off just to make our point. If people are quiet, they just need to learn to listen or learn to speak up. Any issues with the way the group is operating are the chair's problem to deal with, and not mine, not my job. And no one should cause any waves by raising uncomfortable issues. So now nobody is really going to create those types of group norms and write them down. But has anybody here ever operated in a group that you go, you know, I see this happening, and it's very much, it just, nobody wants to talk about it, so it becomes an accepted norm of the group. Has anybody ever seen that?
And I will tell you, if you are trying to break a regional norm of starting late and running past the end time, you are like that salmon trying to swim upstream. It is a bear. Because you can start on time, but if your people are all saying, I'm not even going to arrive until 10 after, forget it. You know, your first 5 minutes will be people just texting you saying, I'm late, you know, you know, but I encourage everybody to keep trying, because eventually we're going to change it, but it is, boy, it's a bear.
Right. So that's a tough one then, huh?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think if the group starts on time, then they will. If you're say 9 o'clock and your group starts at 9 o'clock continually, and they're just come in and they're late, then the next time they'll probably try to be there a little, or maybe not the next time, but then the time after, then they're like, oh, I've got to be there at 9 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
I had done like a facilitator training, and that's what they said. Always start on time. No matter if you're waiting on the chairperson, start the meeting on time, and then eventually it'll become a habit, and everybody, unless there's an emergency, will be there on time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I hope that by the end of this session, you'll have some tools to use to actually talk to people about, do we really want to start on time and end on time? So we'll bring that up again as we go through some of these tools.
And I apologize for this background noise, but I do want to say that it's another a regional thing that I've observed is that boards really don't like to raise uncomfortable issues.
Mm-hmm.
They'll be happy to tell you all about it beforehand. They'll be happy to argue with you afterwards one-on-one, but they do not want to be the one who brings it up. And again, I think we have to continue to address that. At least it's my observation that it's a regional norm. Because you just don't call a problem out because I guess you feel like you're calling a person out instead of calling a problem out, and
That's right.
And that somehow folks are going to get angry and get mad and I don't know what all. But that's another one that we have to work really hard to change.
So we'll talk about that a little bit later too. But so what we're looking at here are somewhat the second set of norms are things that you might see commonly represented in a meeting, and people may even have these written up and post them on the wall, and they're good procedural norms. Our meetings will begin and end on time. Does it always happen? Maybe not, but at least they're written there as a spoken group norm, right? We will listen to each other without interrupting. Okay, so that's a good kind of procedural norm that will do that. But what about the person who talks incessantly, and how do you handle them if they're, how does that communication work? So we're going to talk about that a little later. We'll offer a chance for everyone to speak, which is part of not interrupting people, of course. But taking airtime and giving airtime are part of what needs to happen. We'll talk about how to do that. We will support our chair's efforts to facilitate meetings and practice team leadership. So we look at the way our group works together as a team effort and not as the responsibility of one person who's trying to chair the meeting. And we'll raise any concerns about the way the group is working together. Again, this is one of those things that can be difficult for people to do in this culture, but we're going to talk about a little bit more about how to do that in some communications behaviors. And so you just get some sense here of how you can have spoken and unspoken norms in a group. And at least by articulating some spoken norms, then you are making some forward progress in getting everybody on the same page. So why create group norms? And there are a few reasons for this. So these group norms govern how your advisory board members want to interact with each other. And many times people in groups develop those norms, as we said, without conscious awareness. That earlier example that I used about, a new person comes in, they sit in the wrong chair because that's always Susan's seat or whoever's seat. And in this case, usually those kinds of norms, it's not like you have assigned seating in a meeting, but you've got this unintentional kind of informal group norm that people have certain places where they sit. And so those norms may just develop naturally over time. So, and sometimes, that natural development works out fine, but then there are other times that it could get in the way of communication, particularly if you're dealing with issues where team members may want to get together, or group members get together before or after a meeting, and they grouse about that person that talks too much, or they say what a stupid idea that person had, and they talk about it amongst themselves, but they're not doing anything to help the entire board or the entire team to deal with it. So that's a common thing. So why do we create group norms? Group norms do a few things. They create and nurture this connection among group members, and that's true connection, so that people can really be transparent and talk to each other. So it creates an avenue and a tool for people to use to make that connection. Improving communication by, again, holding people accountable to having communication as a team and a group. Group norms can help clarify decision making, particularly if the group norms support getting good data to everybody and getting everybody on the same page about what important words mean, what important terms mean, so that they feel like they're all making decisions based on the same set of information. Group norms facilitate conflict management because, as you know, people have conflicts in groups. And so it could be, that there are tools within the norms that assist with communication, and the norms that we talk about will help with that we're going to talk about, to help deal with conflict when it does arise, so that you are able to manage that or maybe even resolve the conflict. Sometimes we can't completely resolve conflict among people, but we can at least manage it so that they're still able to work together in a way, even if their ideas and opinions are very different. Having group norms is also a good way to orient new members to how the board works together. So you have something in writing to share with them so that as soon as they come on board, even as part of their board orientation, you might say to them, yeah, we had this board manual. As part of the board manual, that gives you kind of your duties and responsibilities, but also be sure to look at this section that talks about our values and our communication kind of behaviors that we expect and the ground rules we expect for how we work together. And this is what you can expect when you come to work with us, and we hope that you'll contribute to that. And having group norms can also help keep meetings on track and more productive, because it can help with those communication pieces in the group, and help keep people focused in a way. So those are some reasons why you want to create those group norms. So what we're going to talk about now are actually some ground rules that are from Roger Schwartz, who is out of North Carolina with Schwartz and Associates. He actually proposes 8 ground rules for effective communication, and he talks about them more in the context of behavior. And so some of those ground rules and some of those things that we looked at on those earlier lists are really procedural things about starting and ending on time, or you might hear people say, turn your cell phone off in the meeting. And so those are procedural things that can contribute to good communication because people are operating within this same kind of behaviors that way. But then there are these much more complex behaviors around communication that if we can state them more succinctly, then let's say one of the ground rules that we have is we're going to respect everybody in the room. That's a little bit hard to understand. What does it mean if we say we're going to respect everybody in the room? It's hard to tie. I mean, we can say everybody's going to tie a behavior to that, and a behavior might mean that we don't call people names, we give everybody a chance to talk, but we're not stating that clearly in that ground rule. So these behaviors that Roger Schwartz proposes are a little bit more in depth than that. So let's take a look at these. The first one is to state views and ask genuine questions. So what do we mean when we say state views and ask genuine questions? When we work in groups and teams, typically we have several people around the table, and we may find ourselves advocating for our own beliefs and our own ideas. And that's appropriate because we're there to help lead, to help give our opinions, to help drive the group forward in the work that they're trying to do. But have you ever been in a meeting where you kind of feel like it's a monologue because there are one or two people in the room, maybe a dialogue if there are 2 people in the room, who are doing all the talking, and they don't stop. They just continually advocate for their position. So they're stating the views, but they're not asking genuine questions. So has anybody been in that situation? Yeah. Yep. So what do we do if we say, it's great to state your views. We want you to state your views because you're a leader here. We're all leaders here. We all want to be able to state our views, but we also want to ask genuine questions. And so if we talk about asking genuine questions, what do we mean by that? When someone asks a genuine question, they'll advocate their view, And then they will ask a question that's something like, so what are your thoughts about that idea that I have? So that's a genuine question because it's open-ended. It invites the other person to talk. And at that point, the person who's advocating actually stops talking and listens. They're asking a question out of genuine curiosity. Now that's as opposed to a rhetorical question. So if they're going to ask a rhetorical question, then they state their opinion and they state their idea, and then they say, and that's a really good idea, don't you think? So they're asking a question, but how's the group going to respond to that? Or how is another group member going to respond to that rhetorical question?
They're trying to get them on their side. They're trying to sway them to that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, if you answer negatively to that, then it's like you're not accepting their idea.
I've heard another one recently, and it's just they're going along and they're stating this, and like something, nobody reads the advertisements in a newspaper, right? And you're just led into this acknowledgement that they're right in that assumption, and you have to like almost pull yourself back to go, wait a second, no, I don't agree with that at all.
Mm-hmm. And it puts you in a very conflict-oriented mode immediately because you're having to conflict with them. But if as board members we can agree to state our views, yes, but then ask those kinds of genuine questions that are like, can you tell me more about what you think about that? Or what are your thoughts about my idea? And then stop talking and let the other folks talk. So any questions about or thoughts about stating views and asking genuine questions?
Donna, sometimes if you can get a word in edgewise, you can stop someone who is monologuing and just say, ask the genuine question of them. So I don't understand exactly how your idea is different than Susie Q's, or something to ask them to consider their idea from a different perspective, and then throw it open to some other members of the group to be able to chime in.
Yep, great. Yeah, and that is a good way to ask those open-ended questions to get other people to chime in is really good. So the second ground rule is to share all relevant information. So why do you think information is important to decision making?
Well, we want to know all sides, all views before we actually make a decision. We want to know all the information, the background of it.
Mm-hmm. And then have you ever tried to, or made an important decision and then found out later that you didn't have all the information you need, and maybe somebody in the group had that information, but for some reason they didn't speak up?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I've walked right into hornet's nest where people haven't advised me that it's a touchy subject. Mm-hmm. And I go in thinking, oh, here we go. And, come back with my face in a separate container because of the conflict that I ran into.
Yeah. And so that relevant information can have something to do with data that informs the project, or that kind of cultural or anything that's relevant to the work that the board is doing and that people are getting into, it's important to share. And so if you have your board members agree that it's important that we share all relevant information, then hopefully we can avoid some of that kind of situation that people, might find themselves in. So this also could mean that if a board member has relevant information to share when a group member maybe is not behaving in a way that supports the group norms, they see an action that this group member is taking, that this information is going to be shared. Now we'll talk about that a little bit later too, but it could be that you have to decide when it's appropriate. If somebody is talking too much in the meeting or not respecting other people, not asking those genuine questions in a meeting, at what point is it relevant to share with that person that, it might be helpful if you would let other people ask some questions, or stop and ask your questions and wait to hear the answer and then try to listen. And so, at some point you may pull a person aside to do that so you're not embarrassing them in front of the group, or it could be that the team has to handle it if it's something that is, really impacts the whole team and the whole team needs to be involved. But we'll talk about that a little bit more a little later too. So let's move on to the next slide. If we agree on what important words mean, this is the third behavior. So different words obviously can mean different things to different people. And a good example of this is once when I was leading a workshop at Brushy Fork, and there were two people in the room, and one person was talking about marketing for tourism in his community. And he said, well, we try to tell people this is like coming home, because that's a nice fuzzy feeling for people. And a second person in the room kind of piped up and said, you're right, that is fuzzy. What does that really mean? And so for the person who said, we try to use language that's fuzzy to people, he meant warm and welcoming. This other person meant, that sounds really unclear to me. And so if you have two people coming into a conversation with the same word, but that word means very different things to them, the communication is not going to be very clear. If a facilitator of a group, or if other group members can recognize when two people are seeing a word from very different perspectives or have very different meanings for it, then, it's good to just bring that up to the group, to acknowledge it. I think that when you say fuzzy, you mean something different than he means. Can you all talk more about that? So now we got a chuckle, actually. We laughed about that because it was kind of a funny moment when that happened. But there can be really important words that your group needs to settle on, about a grant making strategy that you're trying to do in your community, or what does it mean to serve a nonprofit? When we say nonprofit, is it only 501c3s? How are we using that word? So, in more serious meetings and more serious projects, not having that shared understanding can mean that people are not able to come to agreement because they're not even talking about the same thing. And so just bringing that up and calling it out can be important.
Sandy, do you have a question?
I was just going to make a comment. I wasn't sure if a raised hand worked or not, but I didn't want to interrupt. But as we attempt to create more diversity on our foundation boards, that becomes even more important because, just different perspectives of individuals have a different series of language, or different words have different meanings. And it's very important to know that the communication is happening like you want it to happen.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And sometimes as you're trying to, particularly if you're working among different cultures and diverse cultures that way, it's helpful for people, they can't really just create and articulate a definition, but they might be able to give an example. And so using examples as a way to get shared understanding of words is a way to move forward too. So. But yeah, diversity, as you create diversity on your boards, I think you will see that there are some things that need to be considered like that. So then the fourth behavior for effective communication is to explain your reasoning and intent. And now this doesn't mean, in a way, may sound like you're having to justify yourself all the time, but that's not really the point. The point is that it can be good in explaining your reasoning and intent on why you are advocating for something, why you believe something is the right way to go, because it's just good communication and can be supportive of promoting that kind of communication in your group. The important thing, again, is to avoid turning that explaining your reasoning and intent into that monologue that we talked about before, where you're constantly advocating. Again, it's that state your views, explain your reasoning and intent, and then ask genuine questions about how people see that and if they see it differently. And then if you find that other people on your team have a different reasoning, each team member should be given space to talk through their reasoning and intent. You can see that this kind of communication can take some time. And so as you're putting together agendas for your meetings and things, if you end up adopting some of these kind of behaviors and having them as ground rules for how you work, then you want to think about that and how you're putting together your agendas. So. The fifth behavior is related to explain, let's go back. The fifth behavior is related to focusing on interests and not positions. So that is, well, let's see. Let's think about what is the difference between an interest and a position. So you might think of it this way. Interests focus on identifying the needs that must be met in order to solve a problem. So you think about the needs. Positions focus on a specific approach, and they don't have room for negotiation. So let's think about an example where a group is going to paint a wagon for a parade. And John wants to paint the wagon red, and Sarah wants to paint the wagon blue. So those are their positions, and there's no room for negotiation from them. So a group member then says, ask everybody in the group to complete the following statement. So if we think about this statement, no matter what color we paint that wagon, we need to paint it in a way that ... And John says, we need to paint it in a way that uses the red paint that's in my barn so that I can donate that paint for no cost. I have all the paint we need if we want to paint that wagon red. And Sarah says, well, we need to paint the wagon with some blue on it because the color blue honors our police officers, and this parade is about honoring our first responders. So that's why I want to paint the wagon blue. So now what do you observe here that allows for some negotiation?
Well, the blue goes along with their theme and what they're trying to honor, and the red is kind of a self-interest of sorts, even though he's trying to donate it, but it's, you know, for him particular individual.
Right.
After I hear that example, I'm left wondering if John would be okay with a different color if they were able to obtain the paint for free, because it sounds like his interest is to do it for low cost.
So there's a negotiating point that, you know, I can also get blue paint for free, so we could paint it blue. Or perhaps they could say, we're gonna, you know, what if we paint the majority of the wagon red and then do some blue themed kind of first responder posters that we use the blue paint on so that we're meeting Sarah's interest. So there's more room for negotiation when you come at it from the position of looking at interests rather than positions. So the sixth behavior that we want to discuss is testing assumptions and inferences. So let's talk about what we mean when we talk about assumptions and inferences. As human beings, we are hardwired to make assumptions. It is a self-preservation mechanism for us. For example, when we see smoke, then we assume that there's fire. It's a way for us to stay safe. We're not going to go over there where that smoke is, or we're going to go find out if there's fire, if there's smoke, so that we can take care of the problem. Or if we're in a situation where we're around a dog and the dog growls and shows his teeth, then we might assume that he's going to bite us. And so we change our direction. We go around the dog and don't walk close to him. But then how does this kind of almost self-defense mechanism play out in meetings? We might see a team member enter the room, and usually they sit next to us at the table. But today, for some reason, they sat on the opposite side of the table from us. And we're looking at them and we're going, why did they sit over there? What did I do? So we infer that that person is angry or upset at us because they entered that room and they sat down in a different chair, and it's almost like we assume they did not want to sit beside us. So we infer that they're angry with us, and then we enter that meeting with that kind of frame of mind. So we're, during the meeting, thinking about, why is this person angry at us? We've gone up, so there's a thing called a ladder of inference. And at the top of the ladder of inference is where you make those high mind judgments that are based on behavior, but may not necessarily reflect the actual behavior. So Jacqueline came into this meeting And she sat all the way over across the room from me. She must be angry at me. Was that observed behavior? No. The observed behavior is that Jacqueline is at the bottom of the ladder, and it's that Jacqueline sat across the room from me. I went up the ladder. I took the penthouse elevator to the top, and I said, well, Jacqueline must be mad at me because she sat all the way across the room. I wonder why she's mad at me. And then I start getting all, angry and upset about Jacqueline. So how do we keep this from happening? This is where it's fine to have these assumptions and inferences. The thing is that we want to test them. So we strengthen the whole group when we stop making these assumptions and inferences about people and about the work that we're doing. So how do we test them? I would just go up to Jacqueline, and what I do is I don't start out saying, why are you mad at me? Because there I'm starting out with the assumption that I've made. Instead, I say, well, I see that you sat across the room from me. Did I do something? Or is there some reason that you wouldn't want to sit with me? And are you upset? And this gives Jacqueline an opportunity to let me know that, oh no, I was just moving across there because the air conditioning in this room is so cold and the vent blows straight down on the chair that was beside you. So had nothing to do with her being angry at me, even though I had created that in my mind perhaps as an inference or an assumption, and everything to do with the fact that somebody needed to turn that air conditioning down. So that's how you would just test those assumptions and inferences. Any thoughts or questions on that? Okay, well, let's move to the next slide. So the seventh behavior is to jointly design next steps. Now, have you ever been part of a group where one person says, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this, so y'all come meet me on Saturday morning and we're going to have this great thing. And then Saturday morning comes along and only 2 of the 20 people show up. So what do you think would have happened differently if they had jointly designed how to move forward?
Well, the jointly designed would have had more ownership for individuals in that. I will tell you, I'm very guilty of this. And a part of it, and I look forward to more discussion on it, is the inability to get individuals to want to help you design something. I think because they know that they'll be, building their ownership and they don't want to. So often one winds up with trying to think these things through and to organize it. And at least for me, I wind up and I'm there by myself. So
I know the thing that I struggle with sometimes is that sometimes in our work, we have to work so quickly that it's very difficult to jointly design next steps too. And then you do end up taking on a lot because you are feeling guilty for not jointly designing next steps sometimes, and and trying to balance that with, well, we just got to get this done fast. So what about other thoughts?
I think it's about ownership. Yeah, that they have interest in. That's.
So if we think about the Community Foundation Board specifically and about designing next steps for things like grant-making programs or programs to be, I know in the Upper Cumberland, you're trying to become a kind of a hub for nonprofit development and support. And so the strength of jointly designing next steps in that, even, engaging some of the folks that you're working with there, some of the nonprofits you're working with to help jointly design next steps for the programming that you're doing can be critical to even having participation from the nonprofits that you're trying to serve. So.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with just kind of educating the public so they understand, the process that the Community Foundation can do this. I mean, that's the benefit of having one, is to help those nonprofits be better and leverage what they have and how to make them better all around their own boards, as well as educating the public about what they do and their nonprofit.
Sure,
Mhm.
sure. So now the eighth behavior, and this is the tough one. This is the one that Sandy brought up earlier about how do you get these undiscussable issues up there? So that's what we're talking about when we say, well, it's the culture here to be nice, to not raise issues. If somebody makes an off-color joke, or if somebody isn't getting to meetings on time when they really need to get to meetings on time, we actually in our culture consider those things to be undiscussable issues.
Yep.
Because we just don't confront people here.
Right.
So how do we create a culture within our board where we can discuss what we consider to be undiscussable? Those are the types of things that are often swept under the rug, and they feel very personal to us, I think. And so it's hard to become comfortable ourselves unless we practice in discussing these undiscussable issues. It's also if people come to agreement about sharing all relevant information, part of sharing all relevant information is doing this, is discussing these undiscussable issues. And so if you take these behaviors for effective communication as a package, and you say, we are going to share all relevant information, and sometimes that relevant information is a way that we can talk about things the way as a group that we want to work more effectively together. And one way to do that is for everybody to show up on time. And we don't really talk about the fact that some of us are late to meetings. So let's just talk about that as a group. What can we do to help people get here on time or join the call on time? So how do we talk about that and try to troubleshoot that as a group rather than calling out one individual in front of the group? You can talk about it as a process and a ground rule. And then let's say that you've got something that's, the starting and ending on time is a little bit maybe of a safe zone for that kind of conversation. So that might be one of the early conversations you have about undiscussable issues. But let's say that you have a board member that your board has said, we are not going to make jokes based on racial or ethnic humor because we have a diverse board, and we know that some certain types of language or some jokes could be offensive to people. And then there's a board member who makes a joke that she just doesn't see as racial. She doesn't understand or doesn't see the undertones there because sometimes we don't see it. We haven't been exposed to the same experience as some folks. So if the board has defined values, and they have a defined value that says, we are diverse, we're going to embrace diversity, we're going to be careful of racial overtones, and we have decided as a board, we have adopted this ground rule for effective behavior, effective communication behavior, that we're going to discuss undiscussable issues, it gives somebody a tool to pull that person aside. And again, because this is one person raising an issue, raising a joke, you don't necessarily want to call them out in front of the whole group. But if you've got these ground rules adopted, you can say to this person, we've got this value, and I don't know if you realized, but what you said really has a racial undertone to it. And we are trying very hard to embrace diversity and to not share that kind of joke. And the conversation is not going to be an easy one, but if the group has said we're going to discuss undiscussable issues, it's not you personally confronting the person in a way, even though you are, but you're doing it within the framework and the context of saying, we have this effective behavior that we're trying to model and to do, and so I'm doing that now. Has anybody had experience dealing with something like that, where you've actually had to talk to a person about what you would consider an undiscussable issue?
I don't like conflict, and so I try my best to avoid these.
Yeah.
And I will do somersaults trying to justify that it's not an issue that warrants the use of my social capital or those types of things. It's also one of those things in which I be like, well, it's pretty I don't know, arrogant of me to think that my work exceeds whatever it is that they were doing that prevented them from being able to get there. And one of the topics that I find it challenging with our board is just the idea of individual giving. You know, we've said that we don't care what the amount is, we just want all board members to annually give, but yet, you know, that's not heard by everybody.
Yeah.
And you can remind and you can remind, and after a while, when you do the great proclamations to everybody, you're starting to offend those who have given, because they're tired of hearing it about the people who don't, so it becomes tricky.
Yeah, so that's a pretty unique, undiscussable issue for your board then, to be able to, you know, to deal with that. And yeah. Yep, those conversations are not always easy. And I think that in the case where just thinking about this, that sometimes it's appropriate with these undiscussable issues to pull a person aside, and sometimes it's appropriate as a whole group. And you just have to kind of use your gut instinct as to when it's the right way to talk to somebody about these kinds of issues. But if you have 2 or 3 people on your board who are habitually not giving, it could be that having a conversation just with them and saying,
yes,
you know, when you join the board, we hope you'll do this. And please understand that it could be $5. It could be $2. You know, we can then say 100% board participation in giving. So that could be a conversation that might need to happen one-to-one with people, just to help them understand that it may, you know, perhaps even explain to them, don't feel bad if you have to give $2 or $5, or, you know, it really is that we can say to a funder that 100% of our board gives.
Yeah, I think that's important. So, but it is hard. It is a hard, it's hard. You know.
And again, I think in our culture and in our, in communities that don't always have a lot of assets, it's hard to tell people to give. So, yeah. So if we go to the next slide, there are important things to consider if your team or your board decides to take on these behavioral ground rules, the 8 that we described. There are steps to go through to adopt those behaviors. Part of that jointly designing next steps, it's to work as a board to adopt the behaviors. And so you would need to have conversations with your board about what each of those ground rules really means. So talk about each one and agree on what those important words mean within those ground rules. You know, it's very specific language about behaviors, and you want people to understand what that language is. The behaviors don't become ground rules unless your board adopts them and the members agree to use them. And then they develop over time kind of a common understanding and a common way of working together that just becomes natural after they practice these ground rules. And then second, because the board works as a team, rather than having one individual who is responsible for all these, then you know, there should be some conversation about what it means for everybody to be responsible for the use of these ground rules. Particularly avoid making it the responsibility of one designated leader to enforce these behaviors, because then it becomes more of an enforcement thing and less of a group kind of adopted norm. So all the members should share responsibility to be empowered to intervene if they see an issue that arises in the way that someone is supporting the way the board wants to behave. So board members should probably have a discussion about what it looks like to intervene, that sometimes it may be that the meeting is going awry and somebody in the group stands up and says, it feels like we're not talking well or communicating well together, so let's think about our ground rules and try to do better with that. Or they, it may be a situation where one person in the group says, well, I saw such and such over there just not paying attention during the board meeting and not interacting, so I'm going to have a conversation on the side and just check in with them and see what's going on and what's wrong, and try to get them to work with the group more. So, and then third, the board should use these ground rules, revisit them occasionally, talk about them specifically at a meeting, and evaluate how your board is communicating with each other, with people who are your donors, with people who are in the community, and those types of things. So you could even take a few minutes at the end of each board meeting and have a little discussion about how did we apply our ground rules, especially if you start out deciding to adopt some or all of these ground rules. Then you can have discussion about, are we using these effectively? Are we understanding how to use them? And so, you put some time and effort into that. Then it will help your whole team get better and your whole board get better at communication. So those are some steps to think about when adopting these behaviors. And then let's go to the next slide. And sometimes it's these little things that are helpful in communication. And so some small pointers that you can use are those open-ended questions. Can you say more about that? Or do you have thoughts about the idea that I raised? If it's a particularly, if there's a contentious conversation going on and the person seems a little defensive, you might intervene by saying, well, what do you envision as the next step for that? Help me understand where you're going with this, if it's an idea that seems really off base. You can avoid using the term or the two words together, yes, but, because that puts you in a confrontational position. Instead, try using yes, and, so that you're really feeling more like you're building on ideas. Take a breath if things are feeling like they're ramping up, and acknowledge if it's a situation where you're starting to feel yourself feeling reactive, acknowledge that. Take a breath and say, I feel like I'm getting a little defensive here, so I just want to step back for a minute and scale down our conversation, and maybe we'll pick it up in a few minutes. And so let's just take a break so that we're not flooded with emotion during the conversation. Just gives yourself an opportunity to take a breath and a break. Also, you should try to become comfortable enough, and this is a hard thing sometimes, but become comfortable enough with silence to give people time to respond. So if you're in a meeting and you've done your advocating and you've asked that open-ended question, just remember that people are processing. And so it's okay if the room goes quiet for 30 seconds until somebody speaks up and responds. They will respond. People feel silence, and so it will happen. And then just be aware of your body language as well, whether you've got your arms folded and crossed and you're shut off from people, or you're laid back and relaxed when the meeting should be a little more intensive than that, or you're frowning as you're talking. So just trying to be aware of body language and how open you are with that. So those are some individual things that you can do to support good communication. Does anybody else have little tricks that you use or things that you do to support communication that you could share?
If I see that there are individuals that are not participating, I will specifically ask them outright to make sure that if they do have a thought, that we have at least given them an opportunity to share it, so that they didn't feel like that they were having to, merge their way onto a busy interstate of instructions, but had this moment dedicated to them to be able to share. So, yeah. Yep.
Sometimes when I'm running meetings for folks, I will, if I notice that there are several quiet people in the room, I'll give folks an opportunity to just jot down a couple of ideas, because some people process by writing. And so to use that as a technique, if you've got quiet people in the group, gives folks who are introverted a chance to kind of gather their thoughts, because oftentimes they have to do that. you know.
And Donna, I really like in the few meetings that I've been in that has this, where they utilize the anonymous check-in features where you can ask a question and everyone can, without any loss of status at all, they can share, I agree or I disagree, or those types of things, so that you can get a feel for how everybody is really thinking about something instead of just doing, flowing with the group norm.
Right.
And I wish we could afford to do that more often. I know there's an app that you can utilize, but me and technology never do seem to do well. So,
Yeah.
but anyhow, but those, I really like those because even the shyest person will participate in that. And you might be able to garner out some really valuable information that they just didn't want to share because they would rather have teeth pulled than have to talk in front of people.
Right, right. I've also seen a technique used like that where you can do the thumbs up, thumbs sideways, or thumbs down. But again, if you're in a situation where cultural wise, it would be bad for somebody to say, oh, thumbs down to your idea, then to do it more anonymously than that can be good. So anyway, those are some of the little things. And, to think about those techniques is, it's a good thing to have a little toolbox of techniques. So there are also, and we're almost done here, but there are also some underlying principles to consider. And I didn't go over these at the beginning because I actually believe that those behaviors for effective communication support these in a group. And so I think they're going to they actually will strengthen each other. So we hope that in our particularly volunteer situations, that we're operating in the realm of these 4 underlying principles, that we have compassion for each other, that we're operating in transparency, that that we're pretty open and honest with each other, that we all are committed to the success of the group or the board, and that we've made a choice to be there, and that we're making choices every day to be there and to be active in this group. And so these underlying things, groups that work in the realm of compassion can adopt those ground rules and behaviors without the kind of blame and anger that we might see surface in groups that don't practice compassion. So that practicing compassion is the ability to see things from the other person's point of view. When people hear the word compassion, they may think almost like sympathy and empathy and all that, and there is some empathy in it, but it's just taking a step back and seeing things from the other person's point of view and recognizing that they have different experiences than you. And so they may be growing in different directions, growing at a different rate, and that everybody has room to grow. And so we want to bring everybody along in this process. The transparency piece, the groups that operate within as being transparent are trying to see themselves clearly. And so they're open to the idea that they are expressing their values clearly and expressing their expectations clearly. And so that's what we mean by transparency. And then commitment is, again, because especially working with volunteers, their commitment is driven by their passion for making things better in their communities. And so working with other folks who are committed, that passion that they have can create a strong bond to allow them to work through some of the issues that come up with communication. And by having that strong bond, they actually increase their commitment. And then finally, people have made the choice to be there. So they have the choice of staying, and they have the choice to adopt the ground rules in order to make the experience as meaningful and helpful as it can be for everybody in the group. So again, I think the choice piece has to do with jointly designing next steps. So people have made the choice to adopt and design the way that these ground rules are going to be used. So is there any one of these principles that resonates with you particularly, or?
I'm probably not as compassionate with my fellow board members as I should be, just because I'm so into getting the problem solved or getting the next step done. And I often forget that not everybody is as excited about this as I am. So, I just can't understand why in the world you can't be excited about such and such, and that gets me into trouble, into not keeping myself in a compassionate frame of mind, that everyone is not going to be seeing it the same way I do.
All right. So those are kind of big picture principles, but yeah, they underlie a lot. So, so our next slide. So, and Jacqueline, if you'll hit that one more time, or a couple more times, actually, there's a couple more images. Yeah. So if we're going to end up this with just a quick discussion on the group norms that we've discussed, and we've got them all listed here, all 8 of them. And just ideas that you have on if your board adopts these ground rules, or some of these ground rules, if you decide not to adopt all of them for some reason, how will they strengthen your communication in all the arenas where you have to communicate? So you've got board members that you're talking amongst, you've got the foundation that you're communicating with, you've got your donors you're communicating with, you've got the community that you're communicating with, and your grantees, and you're all wanting to do it in the context of these desired results for your board and for the foundation. But are there ways that you think these group norms will strengthen that communication?
I don't see how it couldn't.
And realize I was muted that whole time. Yeah.
All righty. So, well, those were our ground rules for effective communication, and I appreciate that you all joined us today for that.